Welcome to your deep dive. We're tackling something today that I think we all struggle with no matter what level we're at. We're talking about common errors ESL learners make, and we've got some incredible insights from a chat between two experienced language instructors to guide us.
Yeah, it's kind of like peeking behind the curtain, you know. We get to see
Yeah.
what really trips people up out there in the real world, not just what the textbooks tell us.
Exactly. It's like having a backstage pass to the world of language learning. So where do we even start with this? Our experts pointed out verb tenses, especially mixing up the present perfect and past simple as a major hurdle. You know that feeling when you understand the grammar, at least in theory, but then you get into a real conversation and your brain just goes, nope, too complicated.
Oh, absolutely. It's like all that careful practice just flies out the window.
Right. It's fascinating, though, because learners often do grasp the rules. They just struggle to apply them naturally, in the heat of the moment.
It's like trying to remember how to parallel park when you're already running late for that really important meeting. The pressure's on, and suddenly all those perfect practice sessions just poof, gone.
Exactly. And your brain just defaults to the easiest option, even if it's not grammatically correct. Don't even get me started on irregular verbs. Like our experts mention how often learners use um, good instead of went. It's like English just throws these curveballs your way just when you think you're getting the hang of it.
It's true. But you know what? Instead of trying to memorize endless lists of irregular verbs, they suggested focusing on something else. Pattern recognition.
Pattern recognition.
Yeah, you know how sometimes you just kind of intuitively get a pattern without even realizing it? We want to do that with grammar, too.
So instead of memorizing lists, it's about understanding the underlying patterns.
Hmm.
I like that. How do they suggest we go about doing that?
They love this technique called spaced repetition. Now, I know it sounds kind of intimidating, but it's really not. It's just about revisiting those tricky verbs strategically over time.
Ah, so you're not just cramming them in all at once and hoping for the best.
Exactly. It's about fighting that forgetting curve. You know how you can just feel a new word slipping away after a few days if you don't use it. Spaced repetition brings it back just when you need it.
It's like you're refreshing those neural pathways, reminding your brain, hey, remember this.
Exactly. It's about building those strong connections, that muscle memory, but for grammar, you need that consistent practice to really make it stick.
It's like any skill, right?
Yeah.
Practice makes, well, maybe not perfect, but definitely progress. And speaking of making things stick, our experts were really passionate about ditching abstract memorization and embracing real-life context.
Yes. Because, let's face it, knowing how to use a hammer is great and all, but it's way more exciting when you're actually building something, right?
100%. You need that real-world application to make it meaningful.
Exactly. And to really solidify those skills, take, for instance, those pesky phrasal verbs, give up, put off. They're everywhere in English, and they can be incredibly confusing because their meaning isn't always literal.
It's like trying to decipher a secret code sometimes, especially if you're trying to translate them directly from your native language.
And speaking of translations, that was another point they brought up, how relying too heavily on direct translations can really trip learners up.
Yeah, it's like trying to fit square blocks into round holes. It doesn't quite work, does it?
Not quite. You end up with something that's, well, not quite right.
Definitely not ideal. So instead of translating word for word, it's about training your brain to start thinking in English. But that's easier said than done, right?
Absolutely. It's a process. And part of that process is bridging that gap between classroom learning and actual real-life fluency.
It's like you can practice your swimming strokes in the pool all day long, but until you actually dive into the ocean, you're not really experiencing the full force of the currents, the waves.
Exactly. But it's natural to feel intimidated.
It can feel like that moment right before you hit publish on your first blog post or share something really personal on social media. You're excited, but also a little terrified, right?
Absolutely. You're putting yourself out there.
Exactly. So how did our experts recommend getting over that hurdle, that fear of actually using the language in real life?
They're all about finding those low-pressure practice opportunities, places where you can experiment and make mistakes without feeling judged.
So it's about giving yourself permission to mess up, to be a beginner.
Exactly. And the beauty is there are so many ways to do that these days. Language cafes, online conversation groups, language exchange apps.
Okay, tell me more about those.
Yeah.
What do they recommend?
They specifically mention HelloTalk and italki as being really user-friendly and effective. It's like having a conversation buddy right there in your pocket.
That's a great way to think about it. Someone who gets it, who understands the ups and downs of learning a new language.
Exactly. And they were also big fans of immersing yourself in English media, surrounding yourself with the sounds of the language.
Because it's one thing to learn grammar rules, but then you encounter like idioms or slang or just the natural rhythm of conversation, and it can feel like a whole different ball game.
Right. Which is why they love podcasts, especially ones aimed at English learners. They specifically shouted out English with Lucy and the English we speak.
Oh, those are great ones. I've listened to those. They're great for picking up those everyday phrases and nuances that textbooks often miss.
Exactly. They're like a cheat sheet for sounding more natural, more like a native speaker.
And don't forget about the power of movies, TV shows, even TED Talks. It's about finding things you enjoy, things that hold your attention, and just letting your ears get used to the natural flow of the language.
Exactly. And speaking of sounds, we can't forget about pronunciation, which is often a big, I don't know, a source of anxiety for English learners.
Oh, pronunciation, the ever-elusive beast of English learning. It's true. The way we write words in English very often has absolutely zero connection to how we actually say them out loud.
It's true, and honestly, it can be frustrating, especially because there aren't always hard and fast rules.
Right. It's not exactly a phonetic language.
Right, which is why they love this technique called shadowing.
Shadowing. What's that? Tell me more.
So it's all about mimicking native speakers, like really tuning in to their rhythm and intonation.
So it's not just about getting the individual sounds right, it's about capturing that musicality of the language.
Exactly. It's about internalizing those subtle nuances that make you sound more natural, more fluent.
I love that. It's like you're finding the music in the language. Did they have any tips for tackling those words that just seem impossible to pronounce?
Oh, absolutely. They're huge fans of this website called Forvo. It's basically like a pronunciation dictionary on steroids.
I never heard of that.
You can type in any word, literally any word, and you can hear how native speakers pronounce it. And not just one native speaker, but often like dozens from different regions and accents.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. So you can really get a feel for the different ways a word can be pronounced. Did they have any suggestions for visual learners? How can we actually see how these sounds are formed?
Absolutely. They're big proponents of using visual aids, like videos that demonstrate mouth movements.
It's like having a pronunciation coach right there on your screen.
Exactly. You can see how those tricky sounds are made, which can be incredibly helpful.
It's like learning a magic trick. You need to see how it's done to be able to replicate it yourself. Speaking of things that can feel like magic tricks, our experts also got into the weeds of prepositions and word order, which, let's face it, often trip learners up because the rules can be so different from their native languages.
Right. And prepositions. Those tiny little words on, at, in, for, they can completely change the meaning of a sentence. And then word order can be its own puzzle.
It's like you have all the ingredients for a delicious cake, but if you put them together in the wrong order, you're not going to end up with something very appetizing.
Definitely not. And that's why they love this technique called sentence diagramming. You might remember it from school, maybe not so fondly, but it's actually incredibly useful for visualizing sentence structure.
Ah, so you're not just memorizing a set of rules, you're actually seeing how the different parts of a sentence fit together,
Exactly. You're breaking it down, analyzing it, and understanding the logic behind it.
which makes it much easier to remember and apply in your own writing and speaking.
Exactly. It's about building that deeper understanding.
And what about collocations? Those specific word pairings that just sound right together in English, like make a decision or take a break.
Yeah, this can be tricky. And they can really make or break your fluency because they're so common in natural speech.
It's true. You might understand the individual words, but when they're put together in a certain way, it's like, wait, what does that even mean?
Right. Which is why they recommend focusing on those common combinations, really training your brain to start thinking in those natural English word groups.
So it's like learning the steps to a dance routine. You master those basic combinations first, and then you can build from there.
Precisely. And as you become more fluent, you'll naturally start to pick up on those more complex collocations.
It's like leveling up in a language learning game. You gain experience, unlock new skills.
Exactly. But it all starts with building that solid foundation. And that leads us to another crucial point our experts wanted to emphasize.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's not enough to just passively absorb information. You have to actively use the language. You have to produce.
So it's not just about understanding grammar rules or recognizing vocabulary words. It's about putting those skills into practice, using them in real-world situations.
Precisely. And they're huge proponents of writing. Even just short bursts of writing can be incredibly powerful.
It's like taking all those thoughts swirling around in your head and giving them a space to stretch out on the page.
Exactly. And it forces you to slow down, to really think about grammar and word choice in a way that you might not if you're just speaking.
It's like you're actively engaging with the language, flexing those mental muscles. Did they have any tips for making writing a regular habit? Because it can be tough to motivate yourself sometimes.
They're all about using technology to your advantage. They recommend tools like Grammarly for that real-time feedback. It's like having a helpful editor looking over your shoulder, but without the judgment.
Right. It takes the pressure off. What if you want feedback from actual humans, though?
For that, they love platforms like Laying 8. You can post your writing, and native speakers will actually correct it for you.
Wow. It's like having a built-in language partner. That's amazing. Now, we talked about finding those low-pressure environments for speaking practice, but what about those times when, even in a friendly conversation, you just freeze up? You know the words, but you just can't seem to get them out.
Oh, I think we've all been there at some point.
Definitely. It can be so frustrating. So how do you get unstuck?
Well, their advice was to be kind to yourself. It happens. Remember that every mistake is actually an opportunity to learn and grow.
So it's about shifting your perspective, seeing those mistakes not as failures, but as stepping stones.
Exactly. And they also suggested focusing on those small, everyday interactions with English.
So instead of overwhelming yourself with, like, trying to have this perfect fluent conversation, it's about finding those little wins throughout your day.
Yes. Whether it's reading a news article, listening to your favorite English podcast, like this one, of course,
Of course.
or even just changing your phone's language settings, those small things add up over time.
It's about creating that immersive environment, weaving English into the fabric of your day-to-day life.
Exactly. The more you surround yourself with the language, the more natural it will become. Think of it like training your ear for a new musical instrument. The more you listen and practice, the more attuned you become to the nuances of the music.
That's such a great analogy. It's about developing that ear for the language, those subtle rhythms and patterns. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from those nitty-gritty grammar rules to, finding your voice and expressing yourself confidently in another language.
It's a journey, but it's so rewarding.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up here, what's the key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today? What can they do starting today to really level up their English?
I think it boils down to this. Mastering English, or any language really, is a process. It's not a race. And it's about embracing that journey, celebrating the small victories along the way, and remembering that every step you take, every mistake you learn from, brings you closer to your goals.
I love that. So be patient with yourself, find what works for you, and enjoy the ride.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to connect with others. Find that community of language learners who get it, who can support you and celebrate your wins with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because we're all in this together, right?
We are.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. What's one small but meaningful step you can take today to make English a more active part of your life? Until next time, happy learning.